So in this video, I'm going to take you through a lesson plan for introducing visual rhetoric. This could be for a wide range of things. I taught this lesson plan for a document design project where students would have to design some kind of visual element, whether that was a poster, a flyer, a billboard, a bookmark, t-shirt, a bumper sticker, a commercial, whatever it was. But you could do this for any sort of document design project. If you're having your students write formal reports where they need to create a visual element, if you're having students do presentations where they need to create PowerPoints or handouts or something like this, anything that there's a basic element of visual rhetoric in, this is a lesson plan you could use to introduce that. So we started out the lesson basically by talking about why use visual rhetoric at all. What are the benefits of visual rhetoric? And I had students give me some of the reasons why visual rhetoric is beneficial. So things like it grabs readers or viewers' attention because visuals are engaging. It conveys information very quickly and efficiently. And I used the example of a chart or a graph. A pie chart can visually give us the relationships between sets of information much quicker than if we had to read a detailed description of that. And that you can use visuals in order to create certain moods or atmospheres. So these are the kinds of things that students are likely to come up with, and they're great answers. Obviously, if there are additional things that you want to make sure that they're thinking about, you can add those as well if they don't say them. So we started with that question: why visual rhetoric? Then I briefly talked through a set of visual rhetoric or document design elements. Now, I had actually had my students watch a couple of videos for homework about these and read the section in the textbook about visual design, so they were already primed to think about these things. So the idea really was that this was more of a refresher than anything else. So we talked about grouping, and specifically the park system, which I've done another video on. But basically, grouping is the relationships between objects, visual objects or information on the page, how things are oriented. And the park system deals with proximity, alignment, repetition, and contrast. There's a link to my video about that in the top corner. You should check that out if you're more interested in that. Then we talk about the use of color. How does color work? And there's a lot of stuff that can be said about color. So this is a very, very surface overview that we do in class, in this class. So things like color can create a particular mood or a particular atmosphere, environment, evoke certain emotions from a viewer. That's a really important one. Color can be used to create emphasis or to draw attention to particular sections of a document. Color can be used to divide sections. Any of these kinds of things. So color is a really important component, and there's, again, a lot that can be said about it. I talked to them about font. And again, I asked them, why does font matter? And I clarify for them, when I talk about font in this way, I'm talking both about the size of the text and the typeface. So I've done videos before about typeface, about especially the distinction between serif and sans serif fonts, but typeface can also be used to create a particular impression because there's a massive, massive, massive number of typefaces out there. And so if you can find a typeface that in some way aligns with what type of impression you're going for, a fantasy typeface or a medieval typeface or something like that, if you were looking at, for instance, a Dungeons and Dragons poster, which that's relevant. That will come up later on in this video. If you were doing something very sort of loose and summary, you could find a sort of organic, flowery, maybe cursive or handwriting style font, etc., etc. And then size, obviously, is important as well, the size of text, largely because larger pieces of text are typically going to be more important, whereas smaller pieces of text are typically going to be details, and they're going to be less central. So those are some of the key things. We talk about highlighting elements. So in textual terms, this may be things like bolding, italicizing, underlining. But you can also talk about visual highlighting elements like contrasting colors or putting in background blocks of text. Or not of text, background blocks of color. Things like this. So whatever they come up with in terms of ways you can draw attention to particular pieces of information. And then I talk about white space. This is the last of the basic design principles that I talk about in this lesson, or that I more have them talk about, and I just sort of expand on what they say. White space, again, is really important. I've talked about this in other videos about design, but basically white space is the space that is not taken up with information that the reader actually needs. So this is important because it gives readers a break, or gives viewers a break from absorbing information continually. And it's also important because white space gives you the flexibility to do a lot of the other stuff that you need to do in visual design. So grouping, for instance, depends on white space. You need white space in order to create alignment, because you need to have things or proximity depends on white space. If you want to separate things to show difference between them, you need white space in order to do that. So these are the things. And again, I try as much as possible to get students to explain why these principles are important, and they frequently do a pretty good job. So that I think is a really effective way to approach it. Then I divide students into 3 groups. You could do more or less groups depending on how many students you have. But for my classes of roughly 24, officially it's 24, many of the classes end up having not entirely full rosters, but you get my point. 18 to 24, I would say 3 groups really works quite well for this. So I have them count off by 3s, and then each group gets assigned a visual text. So I used a poster for Penn State Survivor, which happens to be up on our bulletin boards at the moment. I used a David Bowie concert t-shirt from the Ziggy Stardust tour, and I used a Pascarilla and Dragons poster, which is a Penn State Dungeons and Dragons group, again, up on the bulletin boards of our university. I would choose at least 1 thing or 2 things, maybe even 3 things that are available in your local community, whether that's university community, whether that's high school or whatever it is, whether that's just in the town, in the city where you are, whatever it is. I would choose a couple of things that are local so that students can see how these things work in practice. And so I assign each group one of those texts, and they have to analyze that text's visual rhetoric. So what's going on? What design principles do you see? What strategies have they used? And how effective are these things? What works and what doesn't work about these different visual texts? I give them a little bit of time to work through those discussions, and then they give us presentations. So each group either comes up or sends up a representative. I don't care. They can I mean, you may want everybody to participate. That's fine if you want to do it that way. Most groups that I've taught this to, everybody participates, or at least comes up. Not every, or at least most of the people will talk. Sometimes you will just have one person or a couple of people who explain everything on behalf of the group. I think that's fine. But basically, they talk us through what they discussed and what they saw visually on that text. Before we start the presentations, actually, I ask everybody to look at the other two texts that they didn't look at, and just very quickly think about what jumps out to them and what, if any, questions they have about these designs. And then after each group does their presentation, I ask the rest of the class, is there anything else that you want to ask about or want to add to what's been said by this group? So we get some additional stuff, and then I'll usually ask each group at least one question to sort of follow up and maybe push their thinking a little bit more. Whether or not you want to do that, that's up to you. But then after the last presentation and discussion and things like this, I'll go through one more time through each of the three visuals. Well, I'll go through twice more. Sorry, we'll go through one sort of rapid fire discussion in 2 rounds, if that clears it up for you. Now, you'll see what I mean as I explain it. So we go through and we look at each of these 3 documents, and with each one I say, all right, what works best about this one? So what's visually most effective with the Penn State Survivor poster? What's visually most effective with the David Bowie shirt? What's visually most effective with the Pascarilla and Dragons poster? And I get their answers. However many people want to say, I think this thing works best. Great. Then I go through again. What doesn't work about the Penn State Survivor poster, and how would we fix it? So this gets us thinking about how we could improve on a design that already exists. What doesn't work with the concert t-shirt, and how could we fix it? What doesn't work with the Pascarilla and Dragons poster, and how could we fix it? So this is a really good exercise to sort of wrap up things. But then I end with one more thing, one more exhortation, I guess. I tell students, as they're walking around campus and as they see billboards filled with stuff, think about which things grab their eye and why. Because when we look at just, say, the Penn State Survivor poster, we can say, all right, here are the visual elements of it, I'm analyzing it. But if we put that poster on a bulletin board with 20 other posters, each competing for the viewer's attention, some things are going to be more effective than others at drawing the eye. And as designers of visual rhetoric, we want to be thinking about what gets people's attention. How do we actually engage audiences? So I ask them in an informal way to just sort of look at posters, look at billboards as they're walking around. Look at bulletin boards, whatever it is. See which pieces work best and what they can learn from that about visual rhetoric.